children. Mr. Pritzker lives in Chicago with his wife in the UK and 2 children. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. J.B. Pritzker.
Thank you very much, Scott. I took great pleasure and note in Christy's remarks that she's a Nebraska girl, because my wife MK is a Nebraska girl. She was born in Nebraska. She is a Cornhusker, so I'm forced to watch those games, and occasionally to wear red, which for a Duke Blue Devil is not a preferred color, let's say. So I very much appreciate that. You guys are really fortunate that Christy, if she's anything like my wife, which I'm sure she is, humble and terrific and very hardworking, you're extraordinarily lucky to have her. And Deb, thanks so much for the invitation to be here, and to all of you at United Way. I'm appreciative, because I love this subject matter. Early childhood education, I really love it. It's something I wish I could spend every minute of my day and every day of the year doing. And instead, I occasionally get the opportunity to talk to other people and try to convince them to help do it. So I thought maybe the best way to start talking about it, I've got a little clicker here, so I think this will work, right? We'll take a shot at it. So how many of you remember the ad that was on television in the 1980s that the Partnership for Drug-Free America put on? And it was basically, they would have a hand on the screen, and it would show you an egg, and then it would show you a hot skillet, and then they would break the egg, put it on the skillet like that, and it would say, "This is your brain, this is your brain, this is drugs," and then they would crack the egg, throw it on there, and say, "This is your brain on drugs." Anybody who was, I don't know, young enough, old enough to watch television has to remember that ad, right? Everybody in this room, pretty much. So, I mean, it had an enormous impact. And it's been called the most effective advertisement ever on television in history, mainly because it is incredibly effective at communicating something that it was, at the time, mostly unknown to people, which was that taking drugs actually caused brain damage. So, you know, there's nothing about brain on this in this commercial, but except the word, of course, but very effective at people understanding this. So, I want to show you this next picture, which I think is equally impactful. On your left is a 5-year-old's brain, fully developed. On your right is a 5-year-old's developing brain that's undergoing developmental stress. And it's the developmental stress that's the kind that occurs every day in low-income and high-crime neighborhoods in the United States. Just look at the circles on that slide, because there are distinct disparities in the activity going on in the brain at age 5 between these two kids. The human brain is built over time, but most of it is, that development takes place at the very beginning of our lives, before we ever get to kindergarten. Neural circuits are wired in a bottom-up sequence, and the capacity to connect those circuits decreases with age. I'm 48, I can vouch for this. While good early life experiences can help the brain develop well, poor experiences can literally cause children to have a lower IQ. Children who were exposed to fewer colors, less touch, less interaction with adults, fewer sights and sounds, and less language actually develop smaller brains. To ensure healthy development, young minds need nurturing, they need stimulation, and they need challenging experiences, like the ones you provide with Success by 6. These experiences thicken the cortex of an infant's brain. They develop more extensive neural structures, and they create the neurological foundations that determine intelligence and behavior later in life. 90% of brain development, 90% occurs in the first 5 years of life, with most of it occurring in the first 3 years. That means that you can't mess this up in the first few developmental years, because if you mess it up, it's almost impossible to reverse. Unfortunately, children born into disadvantaged families, on average, receive less cognitive stimulation and emotional support than those from middle and upper income families. That means that their brains literally are less developed in an optimal way. So for children whose brains are underdeveloped during the first 5 years, all the later interventions in the world, from kindergarten through high school, from remedial education to healthcare to job readiness, are unlikely to fully make up for the lack of stimulation during the first 5 years. So if the picture of the fried egg had a lasting impact for the last 30 years, then this picture ought to have the lasting impact for the next 30 years. It's supposed to be possible for any family in this country to break out of poverty in just one generation. Possible. And any child from any family, even the poorest one, is supposed to be able to grow up to become better off than his or her parents. An opportunity to do so. What this biology shows, however, is that many children from disadvantaged families are not being given the fundamental tools to pursue the American dream. We can all change that. Now I want to make sure that you understand, I want to be clear about one thing. Nothing that I'm saying is to blame parents. Parents all want the best for their children. They do the best they can given the resources, the skills, the abilities that they have. But the reality is that children from low-income families are growing up differently than children from professional families in ways that are both obvious and some maybe not so obvious. Here's an example. One of the keys to brain development is in the earliest years of life is the amount of vocabulary spoken in the home. Now you saw this a little bit in your video about Jamie. A child from a professional family hears on average 2,100 words every hour. But contrast that with a child from a family on welfare who hears 600 words an hour. By age 4, children from low-income families have heard 30 million fewer words than children of higher-income families. Those 4-year-olds are already 18 months behind in their development in terms of their vocabularies. And when they show up at kindergarten, they're most often not ready. There's something else going on in these biologically critical early years, something that turns out to be perhaps more important as the development of cognitive skills such as than those cognitive skills like vocabulary. The most compelling research that helps us understand what's going on in those early years comes from a very unlikely, seemingly unlikely source, if you ask me. A Nobel Prize winning economist at the University of Chicago, and his name is James Heckman. Professor Heckman began researching human development. Now, by the way, this concept of researching human capital development and its relationship to early childhood education is what I find surprising. People don't draw that connection, and yet as a business person, that's the connection that I see. He began researching human development by analyzing the value of a GED, the high school diploma equivalent. But what he found was that, guess what, a GED is really not equivalent to a high school diploma, actually going to high school. He found that those who didn't graduate high school but did obtain a GED were less successful economically than high school graduates. In an effort to discover the causal effect of that, he found himself going all the way back to early childhood. And he literally looked all the way back, starting at looking at 8th grade remedial, 3rd grade reading scores, looking at kindergarten, and ended up in early childhood. What he found was that there are 2 distinct sets of skills whose foundations are built in the early years. They're cognitive skills and social emotional skills, I like to call character skills. So cognitive skills and character skills. Using his Nobel Prize-winning methodologies, Professor Heckman found that individuals who persist in graduating high school are more likely to have developed social-emotional traits early on in life. And those are the character traits that allow them to persist in a job and in school. They show up, they pay attention, they control their impulses, they work toward goals, they know how to work with others, they're motivated, they're self-disciplined. The lesson is that cognitive skills are important, but relatively ineffective without character or social emotional skills, like attentiveness, persistence, impulse control, sociability. Well, if children don't receive the right stimulation and attention in the first few years, they won't be ready to learn when they arrive in kindergarten. Think of the vast amounts of money that we spend. Enormous tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars at the federal level. The vast amounts of money that we spend during the first 13 years of K-12 K-12 education to try to make up for the failure to address these problems over the very first few critical years of a child's life. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Fortunately, there is good news. There is actually a way to solve these challenges. High-quality early childhood interventions, like Success by Civics, targeted to disadvantaged children who are effective in overcoming the gap and have the ability to put disadvantaged children on a better trajectory that can affect the course of their entire lives. There have been 3 significant long-term studies demonstrating the effects of early childhood intervention in disadvantaged children. The Perry program. Anybody heard of the Perry preschool program? Raise your hand if you have. It may be the most important thing to walk away from this breakfast today with. The Perry preschool program in Michigan was an intensive 2-year preschool program administered to disadvantaged 3- and 4-year-olds, lower IQ African-American children. It was done in the 1960s. The curriculum emphasized the development of self-control, perseverance, and social skills in conjunction with basic cognitive skills. Participants were followed into their 40s, so almost 40 years later. They were followed all the way along by the study's researchers. And the results are very dramatic. Graduate from high school. By age 40, participants in the program, which can be seen here in the orange bar, were more likely than their peers to have graduated high school. So these are the kids who went through the program versus kids who didn't, living in the same neighborhoods. They were less likely to be unemployed. They were more likely to have higher earnings. More likely to be in a stable, committed relationship. Interestingly, less likely to smoke. And less likely to be arrested for either a felony or misdemeanor crime. There was a similar study done in North Carolina which also measured health outcomes of early education, and it showed participants grew up to have lower blood pressure, lower BMIs, less hypertension, and substantially less likelihood of diabetes and cardiovascular conditions. Imagine the savings, by the way, not to mention the life quality improvement, but the savings that government and all of us would endure if we could have these outcomes. There was another study right here in Chicago. Participants ended up less likely to drop out of high school, be arrested, repeat grades, or be placed into special education services. Something important to remember when I talk about another program later. These studies show what you probably already know because you're already investors in early learning programs. High quality early childhood education can have dramatic, sustained results that can fundamentally improve the lives of disadvantaged children. Let's look at the flip side of that, which is at-risk children who do not get quality early care and education. You can see these stats: 25% more likely to drop out of school, 40% more likely to become teen parents, 50% more likely to be placed in special ed, 60% more likely to not attend college, and 70% more likely to be arrested for a violent crime. When you put all those stats together, they're 100% likely to cost you and your families and mine a lot of money. Special education, remedial education, and training, anti-poverty programs, and criminal justice are expensive interventions, and they don't have much of a long-term payoff. They don't address root causes, they only address the symptoms. And so I just want to say that, in my day job, I'm an investor. I look for good opportunities to generate returns. And in this case, the returns aren't great if you wait until a child's dropped out of school and landed in prison. I'd rather invest early, when my dollars can actually make a difference in changing the trajectory of a child's life so that they never end up in prison in the first place. This is the Heckman equation. The lowest return on investment comes in the form of job training. You can see that on the far right of the screen. Working backward toward birth, the ROI, the return on investment, goes up through school, preschool, and finally to programs that are targeted at the very earliest ages. Heckman found that investments in early childhood education yield a 7 to 10% return on every dollar invested. Now think about that. So they've done studies on, the returns on investing. I'm talking about us as taxpayer, investing in a prison, building a prison. They've done studies on what the return is to the public for that. Studies on virtually every other kind of investment that the government can make. And guess what? Early learning wins. 7 to 10% return. That's a pretty decent return, and especially in a world where you don't see much return at all. So I'm talking about government spending. There are only two ways to deal with the problems associated with crime, high school and college dropouts, special needs children, and teen parents. Pay for inefficient interventions later in life, or make smart, effective investments in high-quality early learning for disadvantaged children. Now, I recently had the chance to participate in an innovative new way of financing early childhood education. One of your sister organizations, it was mentioned earlier, United Way of Salt Lake in Utah, helped develop the country's first social impact bond focused on early learning. Social impact bonds are a new financial instrument, an important one that generates returns for investors, real investors, not just philanthropy. Return for investors when social metrics are achieved. In this case, Goldman Sachs and I put up $7 million to fund an expansion of high-quality early childhood education in Salt Lake City, in Salt Lake County. We will get paid back with a modest, roughly 5% return if fewer students later enroll in special education services, thereby saving the taxpayers a lot of money. Indeed, taxpayers' return on our investment is much greater than our return on our investment. In Salt Lake County's Granite School District, here was the setup, really, for the social impact bond. In Salt Lake County's Granite School District, there were about a third of all low-income students showing up in kindergarten, unable to pass a basic test, the results of which were they ended up in special education. And by the way, the basic test that was applied, some of you may have heard of this, called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. Very simple test. There's a picture of a boat. Give me the word associated with that picture. A third of low-income children couldn't pass just basic vocabulary like that. So guess what? Went into special education, every one of those kids, because that is required by law. Once these kids started in special education, by the way, and this was in kindergarten, they're starting in special education, they would stay on track in special education for, on average, 12 years. And the cost to the school district of that kid going into special education and staying in for 12 years, $31,200 per student. So wanting to address this huge problem, the school district did a study, and they found that if they provided a high-quality early childhood education program to those 4-year-olds before they would show up at kindergarten, 95% of that 33% of low-income kids, 95% could pass the test. and would no longer need to go be tracked into special education. So those are real savings. $31,200 per kid. Thanks to United Way, Goldman Sachs, an advocacy organization locally there called Voices for Utah Children, and the local government, thousands more children will now have the opportunity to attend high-quality early learning programs. Now, just want to make it clear here. I told you what the immediate savings were. That's it, to the county, to the school district, the $31,200. The whole prior 15 minutes has been about all the other benefits of early learning. And some of those benefits, by the way, inure to everybody in this room. So that social impact bond is the kind of innovative public-private partnership that we need to do more of if we want to continue to develop and expand high-quality programs that will succeed. Government is out of money. So a social impact bond might just be a solution to a problem, and an easy one, frankly. Government and philanthropy alone aren't going to be enough, but by tapping into capital markets in a new way, by creating this new kind of a security that has real returns to it, has the opportunity and the potential to leverage significant resources to address these problems, resources the government doesn't have, will not have. Several more regions around the country are currently working on developing social impact bonds, and so in thinking about that program in Utah, and on my way here, it dawned on me that I ought to challenge all of you to do the same, to issue a social impact bond, to work together to create one. And I want to work with you. I will put my foundation and myself at your beck and call to create a social impact bond to accomplish, as they did in Utah, early learning outcomes that you might not otherwise be able to get. You already are doing amazing things in early learning. There's nothing I can say about that except thank you for recognizing the importance of it. I think about, it used to be we talked about early childhood education and early learning as if it was some sort of truly a charitable endeavor that had no return about it, or something where we forgot that it isn't just about helping the 1,000 children, that you might help any 1,000 children. It isn't just about them. It is very much about them, but it isn't just about them. The effect of it is so much greater. So when you think about each dollar that you might give away, that you set aside as charity for yourself, think about the multiplier effect of the dollar that you choose to put into early learning. I spend a lot of time talking to corporate foundations and corporate leaders about this. You know why? Because they get it immediately. Many of you are corporate leaders, and you get it immediately. You get that if you can put a dollar into something and get a multiplier effect on that dollar as return, you do that all day long. And it isn't often that you find that in the charitable world. It just doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're dumping money into something and dumping more money into something, and you may not see the ultimate. Here you're going to see the result. In fact, the legacy of Success by Six, the legacy of that is that 20 years from now, the kids who will have received Success by Six, those kids will be sitting in this room. Those kids will be the corporate leaders of tomorrow. Those are the kids who otherwise would be an expense on society, who will become contributors to society. And those kids will live much higher quality lives. Thanks very much for having me.
amazing information, and thank you for your offer to be partners with us. I just speak for the board. We'll take you up on that. I know there are numerous people in the room that sort of looking around, and people got chills, and I saw some eyes welling up. So thank you for offering to work with us. We do have a few questions that were submitted by members of the audience, and I'd like to just ask you a couple if you don't mind. Sure. Okay. One is, what obstacles do you face as you try to engage others in this very innovative approach?
Everybody loves the status quo and nobody likes change. That is, honestly, that is the biggest obstacle. I talked about going to talk to corporate leaders and corporate foundations. And the truth is there's this long history and tradition of corporate foundations. I'm just giving one obstacle, by the way, of corporate foundations giving to education, and their view of education is K through 12. And there's tons of money going into K-12, and in all different directions, by the way. Some of it competing with one another. So they're just dollars, in some ways, going to waste. If corporate foundations and CEOs would take 10% of their foundation education dollars that they're currently giving to K-12 or going forward, if they just set that aside and give it to early learning, I mean, what a huge impact it would have. Huge. So one obstacle is just getting people to recognize and understand the kind of the Heckman equation. I'll just give you one more obstacle. We have an education system in the United States that is, and we all know it's flawed. And universal education is a terrific thing, and it should be a requirement for every nation. The problem is our idea of universal education in the United States is K-12, and yet we're missing the years before that, and more importantly, even than the preschool years, are affecting the lives of at-risk kids 0 to 3. In the home, helping parents learn, knocking on doors, which I know you guys do here. Nurse Family Partnership does something like that. Really getting to where those children are before they show up at school. And for some reason, you go to Springfield and it's like a competition between the lobbyists for K-12 education, which is mostly, let's say, teachers unions and others who want more money to go into infrastructure or other things at school. At K-12 schools, there's a competition between people who want those dollars and people who want early learning. And guess what? There's no established lobby for early learning. There's no major, well-funded, whether it's union-funded or otherwise, it just isn't a lot of money for it. So guess who loses? Those are the two biggest obstacles I see.
For your talk, you've answered most of these questions. One final question now. What advice do you have for organizations like the United Way of Lake County to get businesses and investors involved in improving early childhood development programs?
So, good. What was the other, businesses and what was the other part of it?
Businesses
and investors. Good. Perfect. I think I have the answer. They say a good question is one that you have the answer for, and a great question is one you have a slide for. I think I had a slide up there. Let me just say that one of the things that the slide presentation and some of what I had to say today that you should carry away and talk to businesses and investors about is the fact that there is that economic growth in this country going forward, economic growth, competitiveness, are dependent on what we do about early childhood education now. I mean, that is, so if you think that, the shutdown of the government is going to have an impact on the economy, then you ain't seen nothing yet, because as we lose the 40% of children, 25% that are below the poverty level, 25% of children in the United States are below the poverty level. As we lose them, and I showed you what happens to many of those kids, they're not ready for school, remedial, and then they show up in the workforce and are unable to get a job or unwilling to get a job or end up in prison. If we let that go on, we are headed for economic misery in this country. So if there's one thing I'd say to investors and to business people, it would be watch out. because if we don't do this today, and I really mean today, because we're being outspent and outsmarted by lots of other countries in the world that have figured this out. We have not. So, thanks for the opportunity to speak today.
I do have a gift. It's not in Nebraska colors nor Duke colors, but it's Chicago Bears colors.